Okay, guys, we are back at it. This is the second installment for PowerPoint for 319. I'm getting to you a little late, so I'm going to give you a little bit more time to add your discussions. Hopefully, by give you till Friday to get that done. Of course, there's just going to be more coming, so get them done as fast as you can. I'm going to try to produce them here a little quicker. So today we're going to talk about two chapters. Shouldn't take me too much time, maybe an hour or a little bit more, but I'm going to talk about chapter 20, which is democracy and empire. And then we're going to look at chapter 21, which covers the progressive era. And that'll push us right into the 20th century. And we'll talk about that in just a second, okay? So let's just go ahead and get started. And like I said, what you're going to want to do is take good notes for me. A lot of the stuff, same thing, same principles apply. You'll be quizzed on stuff that I tell you about today. And then, of course, when you add your discussions, I'm going to want to hear from you about things that you thought were interesting, things that you thought were significant. There's that key word. A reminder about the midterm. You have until Wednesday night to take it. It's online. It's under quizzes. Please get that done. If you have questions, email me, and we'll just keep moving. Okay, so I had left you with the story of the business in America, if you remember, the Gilded Age and this idea of modernism and how we were moving into this away from the Jeffersonian ideals, which a couple of you have already commented on in your discussions. What happens is that we're looking at this foreign, not only domestic, in terms of money. And all of that oil, all of that steel has led to America investing in European governments. And this is both good and bad. It's good because it allows us to make some serious dough as we're kind of connected with Europe. But the thing that makes this dangerous, and something that actually George Washington warned us about in his farewell address, and that is, look, the problem is once you get intertwined with Europe, you get the good and the bad with that. And look at this date here, 1908, right? Come back here. And that should mean a lot. If you know anything about the World Wars, the First World War starts in 1914. We're getting to the point where we're really going to be connected to Europe. And we'll talk about World War One next time. Well, we're going to talk about this word imperialism today. And what does it mean? And how do you define it? And how do you make sense of imperialism? And there's a couple ways to define this and look at this, but this is when a country takes control of another country's economic, political, and social resources. And it's similar to colonialism. It's a little bit more invasive than colonialism. But and we'll talk about this, it's this idea that European countries go into these African countries or Asian countries and they take control of them, and then they benefit economically. Or this is a big move here. It's you're gutting their country in order to get rich. And that is really what imperialism is taking control of their socio-economic and political situations. Notice here, I love this picture. I think it's fascinating. America's starting to get involved with this, right? I mean, look at the I don't know if you can read it very well, but you've got Louisiana, Texas, Alaska, California, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. You know, we're growing. We're getting larger and larger as a country, and that's really what imperialism means. And we're taking them in as territories. And I want you to think about the good and the bad that comes with that today. Well, here's a map of the world in 1900. And just to show you, if it's not colored, then they're independent. Pretty insane. Let me give you a couple numbers here. By 1914, start of World War One, 85% of all land was controlled by Europe. That's pretty insane. Thinking this is your little Europe here, and really it's Western Europe, so I circle it. Controls all of this, 85% of this area, and I think that tells us a little bit about what's happening here in terms of imperialism and this idea. And really, to make sense of this, you have to remember this idea we talked about, social Darwinism, which I'll get to in just a second. Well, there it is. Let's talk about it. Social Darwinist thinking, right? You are the white person. You are more evolved. You are more primed, if you will, to control a society. And so it was to the white man justification for moving into these places, and what we identify as the white man's burdens. Actually, by Rudyard Kipling came up with this idea. But notice he's taking the monkey, right, to the, I don't know if you can read that, but this is schoolhouse. And the idea is we are going to help these people evolve. We might even get them to get their skin to turn white quicker, right? You see the sort of the sinister ideas behind social Darwinism, but it allows you to justify going into these places and taking their resources, right? One of the most fascinating stories is, of course, the Congo, where the Belgian came in under King Leopold, and what they were doing was they were getting rubber trees. This is rubber synthetic now, but back then it was made from trees, and they would enslave the Congolese and force them to work this very hard labor. And we estimate 8 to 10 million Congolese died under the Belgian rule there in the late 1800s. That's the sort of social Darwinist thinking of exploitation. Now, what were they saying? Well, they did bring technology. They brought electricity and cars and trains and Western medicine. And so that's the part where they're like, oh, well, we're bringing them good things. Well, you're killing them, So that's imperialism in a nutshell. Well, and this is important that you understand that we're not getting involved in this on a grand scale. We dabble in imperialism. And we're not quite comfortable being England or Germany or Belgium here. We are more trepidatious. And what that means is we see the problems with trying to govern multiple areas across the sea. I mean, let's talk about it. Isn't that one reason why we left? There's something hypocritical about us trying to do this when we said England shouldn't be trying to control a country across the sea. But we do dabble in a couple places. And of course, the first that we really get involved with is Hawaii. Well, it starts with religion, right? And what seems like innocuous or harmless often can look like this, right? We open the door of sending Christian missionaries into Hawaii in the 1820s. But by the time we're in there to the 1850s, 1860s, it's not just religious people coming in. Well, why Hawaii? Well, look at its importance here, kind of its crossroads is what we call it. And if you take a look at this, right, the access to Asia here in South America and Australia becomes the prime location for the Pacific. So that's why we've got our eye on Hawaii here. Well, one person I really admire, and she tries very hard, is Queen Liliuokalani. And Queen Lily is what they called her. And Queen Lily was an amazing person. And when she was born, actually in the 1830s, they sung songs on the beaches for her, because she was this, of course she was the queen and she was going to help the people. And she tried so hard, and she saw the writing on the wall, right? She saw when the Americans were coming in here, first as religious, and then eventually as merchants selling. She knew that this was more than that. And she had a very, very serious comment called Hawaii for the Hawaiians. She didn't think that the white Americans should come in here and try to control the people. And you really feel for her, because on the other side, political cartoons would depict her as being less evolved. Somebody brown, right, cannot and should not be ruling. And so this whole thing It's just bogus, by the way, because Queen Lily was brilliant. She was a writer, a politician, she was a poet. She was very capable, very smart, and she was great, but that's not the picture that the Americans wanted to paint, right? Well, it doesn't take long for America to jump into this. It starts with taking control of the sugar trade, and eventually in 1898, we will annex Hawaii in as a territory, removing Queen Lily from power and becoming, or having access to this great island, strategic island. Now, I love this picture down here because it's demonstrating I think this sort of game here, right? This is England and Germany, and now here's Uncle Sam. He's starting to get involved in this, right? He's starting to play this game of imperialism. Another place we look at is Cuba, and there's a couple of reasons why we look at Cuba. The first thing that we do not like what's happening is the Spanish. They are in Cuba. Now, I touch about the Monroe Doctrine, which was this idea that we don't want any European powers in the Western Hemisphere. Spain is right in our backyard. Cuba is about 80 miles south of Florida. And so we don't like the Spanish are here. On top of that, they aren't treating the Cubans very well. Imperialism tends to lead to misrule and mistreatment of the people. And we saw this, so we pushed back and we said, Spain, you need to back off. And we actually told them that they should leave. Now, we didn't really, we needed a reason to get into a fight. We didn't really want to fight with them. But the Spanish saw this as their territory, and so they weren't going to leave. So we anchor a ship outside of Cuba, outside of Havana, which is the capital there, and we say it's to aid Americans stuck in Cuba. Truthfully, it's sort of us flexing our muscles, I think, saying, hey, we've got warships, and if you don't get out of Cuba, there's going to be a problem. And then something mysterious happens, and you make sure you note this, something that to this day we aren't sure exactly what happened, but the USS Maine, the ship, blew up. And February 15th, it's a mysterious explosion sank the battleship. Now, what we believe, it was probably the boiler. The boiler was running too hot, and it exploded. But that's not the story that we want to say, right? That's not the story we want to tell. And so we're going to tell a different story here, and this is where we point to the newspapers. There's a picture of the Maine blowing up. Lose a couple hundred men here. So it's called yellow journalism. So Joseph Pulitzer, Pulitzer Prize, of course, and William Randolph Hearst are newspaper editors. And, they're in bed with this. They can make a lot of money if we can put this on Spain. And so we leave it up to the New York Times and other publications to accuse Spain of blowing up our battleship. Now, for some of y'all, if you're thinking significance, think about this idea of fake news. This has been a new idea. It hasn't been new, actually, but it's been sort of emphasized lately in journalism. Now, I want you to think about, when do you think fake news started? And what makes something fake? And this is important that people don't understand journalism. And I would argue in some ways our own president doesn't really get it very well, that there has always been fake news. It's always, you could argue, been fairly left-leaning. And it's always been, although, there's always been right-leaning ones as well, too. And it's always only told half the story. That's just the reality of news. They can't tell you the whole story. They're going to tell you the stories that they feel are sensationalized. But I feel like America, we didn't really understand this. But this idea that somehow the news is going specifically after Trump, I don't buy into that. Now, maybe you do. This is a debate to happen. I think this is just the way newspapers are. And do you get the whole story in every side? No, of course not. And I would say that both sides have their news outlets that they go to. But in order of finding a true objective journalist, It's very difficult because that's not the way you get attention. You get attention by highlighting specific things. And we see this in 1898 here as these newspaper outlets actually, I mean, once you look at the headline in the newspaper, remember the Maine and hell with Spain. And Spain's sitting here thinking, and they broadcast the funeral for Maine victim. They're sitting here thinking, we don't even know. You know what I mean? Like, we're not responsible for this. We didn't blow up the ship. And of course, look at the social Darwinism here. This is Spaniard. He's darker skinned, right? So he represents that side. So something to keep in mind as we're talking about this, the development of newspapers getting bigger and bigger, and the idea of, well, this yellow journalism, they only tell the stories that are going to sell. And maybe I'm being unfair to journalism here because let's be honest here, journalists, their integrity lies in their ability to tell the story of what's happening. But that doesn't mean that they don't have their own biases, as most people do, including historians, right? I mean, that's our thing, is that we pick and choose sometimes what to tell, what to remember. Well, there's enough pressure on our president, William McKinley, at this point to do something. And so we decide to send troops to Cuba on April 11th, 1898. And we're going to mobilize 217 service members. First time we will declare war since the Civil War. So everyone's a little bit nervous, right? Remember how ugly that was. So we're sort of wondering, how's this going to go down? Well, I want to be fair to the Spanish, but to be honest, this isn't much of a battle. This isn't much of a war. It's a 6-month war. And we sort of come in there and just wipe Spanish out. The Spanish aren't really at a place to compete with us. Most of the fighting, as you can see, happens down here in the southern part of Spain, or Cuba, excuse me. Places at San Juan Hill is very famous for people like Teddy Roosevelt and Decory, I think he says, landing with some battles here. But, generally, I don't know what happened there, sorry. Generally, it was pretty easy for us to take that over. Well, speaking of San Juan Hill, of course, one of the most famous people that we get introduced to is Teddy Roosevelt. I'll talk about him in a little bit, but he, took this true cowboy spirit. He took 1,000 men with him. They made their own volunteer people called the Rough Riders, and he had this amazing ride up San Juan Hill where he beat the Spanish. Of course, there were African American soldiers already up there that were fighting, but no one talks about that, right? But Teddy proves himself on this. At least he'd always won. We'll talk about it. He'd always wanted to be a war hero, and he found a way to do that in San Juan Hill. Okay, another place that really complicates the story for us is the Philippines. After we take Cuba, we take Puerto Rico. These should sound familiar. And Guam. Both of those, of course, are still United States territories. But then we eye the Philippines, who the Spanish own. And the idea was, well, we have Hawaii, and it would be good maybe to pick out another Southeast Asian country. And so what we do is, and this is where it gets a little dicey, and this is where imperialism gets rough, right, is we talk to locals, someone named Emilio Aguinaldo, and you'll see his name in a second, and we tell him, if you can start some internal rebellion here against the Spanish, we will defeat the Spanish Navy. We do here at Bacoor Bay. We have a huge victory. And Emilio Aguinaldo starts this revolution, who is a local Filipino, against the Spanish. And, within a couple days, the Spanish are leaving. Now, here's the thing about Emilio. Emilio is a very interesting person. He is dedicated to his people and his country. But he didn't really understand what we were saying here. Aguinaldo, when he fought against the Spanish, he assumed that this meant that the war was over, that Filipinos received their independence. But that's not what we had in mind, right? We had in mind something different. We wanted to control it. And I wanted to show you a little clip about this here. And please watch this about the Filipino War.
The president had hoped the Filipinos would willingly become part of the new American empire. But the Filipinos were ready to die for the right to govern themselves. For years they had fought the Spanish. Now they were prepared to fight the Americans, if they had to. In January 1899, they established the Philippine Republic. By 1900, Americans were fighting a guerrilla war 7,000 miles from home.
For the United States to maintain this empire, what the United States had to do was to use force and to project that force across thousands and thousands of miles. We have never done that.
I think that's a key moment. Well, this is something unique to us, right? This is us coming in with an army in a foreign country trying to take possession of it.
We were now involved in civilizations, such as the Philippines, with which we had very little acquaintance. And it was a question whether or not Americans were really that good an imperialist in order to pull this off. This was an extremely brutal war that the United States and the Filipinos fought. Americans looked down on the Filipinos as people who were uncivilized. The term gook originated in the Philippine insurrection. We looked at this as essentially a superior power fighting an inferior people who deserved their inferiority because they had not been able to organize their society. They had not been able to uplift themselves, as McKinley liked to say.
And that's social Darwinist thinking, right? This idea that they are not able or capable of governing, so we better go in there and show them how to do it.
The United States was willing to use very brutal force in order to bring the Filipinos around. One soldier's letter, for example, relates how one of his comrades, an American soldier, had been found murdered outside this village with his stomach slit open. And the American commander immediately orders that everyone in this Filipino village be executed. And according to this young man who wrote home, there were 1,000 men, women, and children who were executed in this reprisal for the murder of this one American soldier.
And this is not, a lot of people don't know about the Filipino insurrection, and it's ugly, it's brutal. And again, it should be indicative a little bit about what the United States Army did to Native Americans too, right? Any white people get killed, we're going to massacre the village.
This was a no-holds-barred war between the Filipinos and the Americans. And by 1900, many Americans are beginning to wonder whether even all of the possible profits that this empire might offer were worth this kind of brutality.
As more and more American boys lost their lives, anti-war sentiment was growing. Many saw the war against a people seeking independence as a monstrous perversion of American ideals. Multi-millionaire industrialist Andrew Carnegie, a leader of a small but important anti-imperialist movement, asked, "Is it possible that the American Republic is to be the suppressor of the Philippines' struggle for independence?" Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines for $20 million and set the island nation free.
You got to love Carnegie, right? Whatever, it's multiple ways to say his name, but I think that's it right there. You know, a lot of Americans are sort of raising an eyebrow here. We are the champions of freedom and liberty. What are we doing over there? Significance. This is a lot of historians say that we repeated a similar thing here in the Iraq War in 2003, where some of the same arguments were used against us invading there.
All through the winter of 1900, Americans read of devastation and horror half a globe away. Time and again, they were assured that the war was all but over. But native spies reported that thousands of Philippine insurgents were plotting to rise up against American forces in Manila. That a stash of bombs and munitions were hidden in a house in the center of that city. That rebels were massing in the provinces. McKinley had been told by his generals that they could subdue their barefoot opponents with 20,000 men. Then the generals asked the president for 20,000 more. But 40,000 soldiers were not enough. By 1900, 60,000 American troops were on the ground in the Philippines. And the War Department was calling for another 2 divisions. McKinley knew that his chances in the November election could hinge on a war he didn't want to fight and didn't know how to win.
And so he pulls out. And he, the war sort of ends in this really, I think we lose 4,000 Americans in the Filipino War, and Filipinos lose hundreds of thousands of them. And we slowly start to remove troops, think Iraq, and we kind of just leave them there. But we still have this sort of connection there. It's sort of an ugly situation. Okay, so that gives us a taste of imperialism. We're in multiple places, but we don't really have much control, and we're not great imperialists. We just aren't. Well, that's foreign. Let's look domestically now. Let's look at what's happening over here. We're going to move over to the Progressive Era. We'll talk about this for a few minutes, and we'll be done today. The Progressive Era, in almost every way, is a response, and you're going to want to note this, to the Gilded Age. Most historians agree that the Gilded Age, which was this very hands-off, no government intervention type of time period, influenced and led to the progressive movement, the Progressive Era. And so you cannot understand one without the other. Well, you can understand the Gilded Age. You can't really understand the Progressive Era without the Gilded Age. So, let's watch how this thing unfolds. And they're responding to all of the problems they see with, remember, the hammer, the golden hammer, and the corruption underneath. Okay, well, where does it start with here? Let's just, remind where we are. We're turning the century. I love this. It's just going to go, I just thought we'd be, as we're moving to the 1900s, let's go on a little trolley ride here. And one thing you're noticing here is the size of the cities now and the amount of people that are on the streets. And you start to see these. I love this picture. You feel like you're almost in a moment where you're going to crash here. True urbanization has hit the streets of New York now. And it becomes full of problems, as we're going to see here. Well, one of the biggest problems, of course, is child labor. And child labor increased during the Gilded Age. There was little protection for these children because there were no rules or laws about that. And that's something that starts to bother many Americans. I want to show you something about Lewis Hine here, who is one of the first real important advocates for getting rid of child labor. Some of these pictures are haunting too, by the way.
In the early 1900s, the general population in those years had very little understanding of what was meant by child labor and child exploitation. The kinds of jobs you would find children working in ranged from the mines, the factories, the cotton mills, to working out on the streets selling newspapers. Injuries, even deaths, were very common among children. The parents would often say that they needed the income that their children brought in, that was what allowed them to continue to survive. A number of parents were advocates for child labor, and their children thought that that was the way life was. One of the first things the National Child Labor Committee did was to hire a photographer. They hired Lewis Hine, who was then their photographer for the next 2 decades.
And that's the key, right? So Hine gets brought on here, and they said the only way to really expose this is to catch him in the act and show the American people what's happening with these kids.
They sent him around the country to identify, find, and photograph children in exploitative situations. He promoted himself as a Bible salesman. He said he was bringing his camera along so he could photograph kids reading Bibles. A boy would say he was 13 when in fact he was 11, or a girl would say she was 12 when in fact she might be 9. The photograph is of a young girl, 10 or 11 years old. Her name was Sadie Pfeiffer, at a cotton mill in Lancaster, South Carolina. She's standing in front of a large loom on a long hallway, staring at and working hard on the job of selecting the quality products. She's probably worked most of the night. It's nearing the end of her shift. She stands there, iconic, as a representative of hundreds of other girls who are being treated just like her and who have no choice. That photograph raised the consciousness immediately. You see that photograph and you cannot look away from it. It doesn't say America. Lewis Hine's stark photographs influenced legislation over a period of roughly 35 years.
Okay, and that's important. This is not something that's going to happen overnight, these changes in child labor laws. But Hine starts to get the ball rolling here with these photographs.
This body of work on child labor represented how he thought and how he felt that children must not be exploited. He represents the most important photographer in terms of social advocacy and social change in the first half of the 20th century.
Okay, so what we're introducing ourselves to is a new type of journalism. You know, I kind of gave journalists a little bit of a hard time for, being sensationalists back then, and still are. But one thing we have to appreciate is what journalists do for exposing the slums that happen because of the Gilded Age. Scraping away the gold from that hammer to show really what we become as a country, that we have become so focused on the wealthy and the rich that we've left some people in the dust. And progressives, and a lot of times, and this is absolutely the case today as well, progressives get tied in with socialism. Now, there is some truth to that, but not necessarily. Progressives don't have to be socialists. Progressives just want protection from workers. And so that becomes a little bit murky, a little conflated exactly what the difference is. But you do see progressives that aren't socialists. These days, they tend to be that way. Bernie Sanders is a progressive, but believes through democratic socialism, that's how you be progressive. Some people think you could be progressive by other means. But many of these people did call for actions which would be identified as somewhat socialistic. Who are some of the major muckrakers, some of these journalists? Well, we already talked about Lewis Hine, but really Upton Sinclair, and I'm going to talk about him in just a second. Ida Tarbell, and Lincoln Steffan. These are three of the more famous ones. Ida Tarbell, I'm going to come back to Sinclair in a second. Ida Tarbell was very important because she, and I love it's she that does this, she writes a history of the Standard Oil Company. And she goes after the most powerful man in America, Rockefeller. And she exposes some of his practices that happen that makes him corrupt. And it's kind of a cool story. Lincoln Steffan goes right in the cities, looks at these corruption, thinks about people like Tweed, right, that we talked about last time, looks at how the government has failed to protect people. But it's Sinclair who tends to be very famous for what he does. And he produces a book called The Jungle. And The Jungle, which was supposed to just highlight the tragedy of the worker in America, people focus on one specific chapter, and that's the meatpacking conditions in Chicago's industry. And he reveals that what's happening to your meat is really tough. It's really wrong. Think about this. There's no FDA back then. So people would do whatever they could to make money. You know, capitalism's in many ways about how much money you can make at cheapest price. So what they would do is they would use meat that was brought from Europe that had been rejected, and then they would put borax on it and color it to make it look brown. In the hoppers, which would sort of like kind of just turn everything out, there were rats in there, and rat poop was in there that he discovered. If you ever get a chance to read part of The Jungle, it just shows you how things really are tough. But it also brings an important question to mind I want you to think about, and that is, what role should the government have in protecting us from, problems with food? And back then it was very simple, right? Don't put rat crap in our sausage. But today, think about this. The government's now stepping in and saying things like junk food and fast food is actually not good for you. And there's been call to regulate. In fact, a few years ago, New York tried to regulate the size of sodas. And then at one point, you could only buy a 16-ounce soda, nothing bigger. The idea being that it was the government's responsibility to protect you, and soda's bad for you, and it leads to all of these problems. Cheetos and Doritos and Oreos, all of these junk food that we know that has been scientifically. There's a great book written called Salt, Sugar, and Fats, and it talks about how Cheetos and Doritos have been scientifically engineered to give you just the perfect amount of crunch, the perfect amount of salt, and then it sort of melts in your mouth. It kind of tricks your metabolism to think that you're not full. This is why you can eat a whole bag of Doritos and still be hungry. That is what some people say, but that's controversial. Do you really want people telling you what you can and cannot eat? Till you cannot have a Dorito? So these ideas are born out of Sinclair's research, which most people are happy about. But do we take it too far? And that's a really big question about progressives. They open the door and invite the government to come and fix some of our problems, and rightly so. Child labor, meat packing industry, food, monopolies. But some people have said once you open that door, they've gotten in and they're too big. Now, that's controversial today. How much government should be involved in our life? And I really want you to think about that question as we're sort of moving through progressivism here. Another important part of this sort of thing is a guy by the name of Jacob Riis, and you should write down his name. That's R-I-I-S. And Jacob Riis, I'm going to show you one clip about him. He exposes just how bad it is with Lincoln Steffan, how bad it is in these cities.
In many cities, slums are growing uncontrollably. Multiple families crammed into one small tenement room. Human waste pours into the streets, alleys, and open courtyards.
People were crowded in. There were windowless tenements. Sometimes you had no internal plumbing, just privies in the basement, in the backyard. And the Lower East Side during these years was the single most crowded place in the entire world.
Jacob Riis, Danish immigrant, crime reporter, photographer. He gets leads for stories from Chief Inspector Burns.
So you have this guy named Chief Inspector Burns, who he really is the first serious policeman in New York City. And he's going after crime, and he creates the first registered criminal database in so many ways. He's got names and pictures of everybody who's committed crimes, so you can see about repeat offenders. That's how good Burns is. And Burns is helping Reese out because Burns loves the fact that Reese is exposing all of this crime and why New York needs help.
Now he's about to expose the hell of tenements. Jacob Reese knows what it's like to be poor. 15 years ago, he lost his job in a stock market crash. It's midnight, but Reese has a new technology that will change the public perception of poverty. An explosive powder that produces enough light to photograph in the dark. This is one of the first ever photographs of slum life. It shocks millions.
In this picture, I showed you when in the Gilded Age, but it becomes the important picture for the progressives. It fuels their fire to really get going with some legislation, some government action to stop this.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jacob A. Reese, and this is how the other half live and die in New York City.
Magazines refuse to print his work, so Reese puts on his own magic lantern shows. His mission, to show America's wealthy something they've never seen before. Filth and desperation on their doorstep.
With this block, 9 dead were carried out this year alone. 5 baby coffins.
What he demonstrated was that there is another reality, that all that prosperity didn't trickle down all the way to the bottom, and there were some deplorable living conditions, and this country was not just forced to confront those conditions, but then was moved to begin to deal with them.
Reese publishes his pictures in a book called How the Other Half Lives. It will sell more than 28 million copies worldwide.
And that's an important book, How the Other Half Lives, is it sort of exposes this, and people read it, and just like they read The Jungle, so you see that it's really these muckrakers, these journalists that really help change things.
Within 2 decades, the worst of the New York slums are torn down. Tenements sell at auction for as little as $1. Reese's campaigning forces all New York schools to build playgrounds and landlords to install toilets inside apartments, not outside.
And so someone like Reese, I mean, Reese shows you more than anybody else that if you want to, you can get things done. Well, okay, so let's take a kind of a broader look at who the progressives are for a few minutes here. Progressives generally lived, or, you know, they had their heyday about 1901 and 1917. Of course, 17 is the year that we enter World War I. We'll talk about that next time. Progressives are really talking about the 3 shuns of the Gilded Age: industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, right? And they're trying to fix this. And they're trying to somehow, what they would say is make things more equal, make things more even. And so what does that lead to is this idea of social injustice and inequality, right? That's a big thing. How do we fix this? And so women, ladies, you get involved here, and they also go after racism to some extent. Their goals really remind, just sort of talked about it in multiple ways. One of them is government, laws, regulations, programs. That's really the key here to this all. Okay, so they want to get states involved. They want local governments to get involved. And you can see here what had happened, that people had sort of dropped off here getting involved in states in participation in presidential elections because it didn't matter during the Gilded Age. So what are some of the social reforms that we get? Well, some of the most important are the 8-hour workday. And again, think about the good and bad, because it's the government coming in and giving us these things, but we open the door for them. Improve safety and health conditions in factories, workers' compensation laws, somebody gets hurt, minimum wage laws, and of course the one they've been always fighting for, unionization and child labor laws. And so these are what you get with the progressives. So some people don't like the progressives. They think that they open up the government into our society too much. And I would say fair enough, I can say argument. But can't you make the argument as well that most people agree that these things helped America? So progressives have their place of importance, whether you don't like them today or not. One of the most important moments that defines why progressives matter comes from something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. And so we're going to watch one more clip. I think it's about the last one we've got here. And then we'll talk about why this is such an important incident. If I can get it to work here.
Max Planck and Isaac Harris, two ambitious Russian Jews, were a couple of the shrewdest operators in the garment industry. Owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the largest blouse-making operation in New York, they were known in the business as the Shirtwaist Kings.
They started out in the garment trade like other people, and they just rose up and, were very successful. And they were people who struggled and made a success, and then exploited other people. Yeah.
I'm sure they looked around their factory and said, these people have no idea how good they have it. They should have been in the tenements with us.
Blank and Harris employed some 500 workers, mostly young women. When the fledgling International Ladies Garment Union called a strike, most of them walked off the job.
So you have this company here, and they're very good. They make garments. And they figure out if they hire just women, they can pay them less, of course, trying to make more money here. But, progressives lead to people striking. So here comes these women striking.
Thousands of other women joined them, demanding their rights that they never could have in the old country. They were becoming Americans. The women spent months on the picket lines before the union and the factory owners struck a deal, and the strikers went back to work. But when the women returned to their sewing machines at the Triangle, not much had changed.
They worked elbow to elbow. It was excruciatingly hot in the summer. As many people were crammed into these huge loft spaces as possible.
The floor was a mess of little scraps of cloth and thread and everything else. They were piled high with garments, with scraps, with work waiting to be sewn, with work that had already been sewn. So they were really fire traps.
Saturday, March 25th, 1911, was a beautiful, balmy day. As usual,
So you have March 1911, March 25th, 1911.
the workers arrived at the Triangle around 8 in the morning and headed for their jobs on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. By quitting time, the young women were already looking forward to Sunday, their one day off.
They were laughing and somebody was singing a hit song. A couple of other people joined in. They used to be able to sing it. Every little movement has a meaning of its own. Every thought and feeling by some gesture can be shown. And then they saw flames rising outside the windows.
Someone had carelessly tossed a match or a cigarette butt into a scrap bin on the 8th floor.
Everything just went up, the whole place was a tinderbox.
A storm of fire tore through the elevators and stairs to the floors above, Kahans Forward reported, to where knots of horrified girls stood in despair.
The disaster was on the 9th floor. The fire escape was not designed for hundreds of panicked people. It tore away from the wall, and 24 people were spilled to their deaths. All the exits were cut off. The door was locked, as it was every day at closing time.
They would keep them locked, I think, to keep union agitators from getting in and to keep workers from leaving with possibly a scrap of material or maybe leaving before closing time.
Thousands of people were out enjoying the afternoon. They heard the fire engines charging through the streets. They saw the smoke rising over the building and could see these trapped workers overhead. They watched as the tallest ladder in the New York Fire Department was raised toward the 9th floor. It stopped at the 6th floor. That was as far as it could go. And the workers began to jump.
The workers wore skirts, and so they looked like parachutes coming down.
A reporter at the scene described what he saw and heard. I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. 62 thud deads. "146 workers were dead."
So you got 146, most of them women. I think 140 of them were women who die here at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And it just makes the progressives angry, right? That's a lot. American people are angry about this. Like, why is it that there's not more protection? So you have to see sort of where they're coming from. Okay, well, let's talk about a couple more things. We're almost done here. I want to hit prohibition and two more things, and we'll be done. Prohibition, of course, is a progressive idea. They say, okay, there are a lot of problems happening out there in the world today, and one of the most important that's leading to abuse and scandals is alcohol. Now, if you recall, ever since the Second Great Awakening, these religious people have been fighting for absence of alcohol since the 1820s. So they finally are able to use the progressive platform to try and stop this. So the 18th Amendment went into effect. It was called the Volstead Act. It was supported by religious people, Protestants, who believed that, drinking led to crime, abuse, and job accidents. And in some ways it did, right? And amazing to note that before it became an amendment applied to every state, 26 states had already outlawed alcohol. So the Volstead Act was called, and you cannot make, sell, manufacture, transport alcohol illegal. Now, when they passed it, they gave alcohol companies and businesses and bars 1 year to get rid of all their alcohol. But what they ended up doing was they took a year and they just stored it all. And then they got involved in the underground game here. And this is, of course, the 18th Amendment, Volstead Act. Well, we didn't have an FBI back then. We didn't have really the type of federal government reinforcement act to do this. So the Volstead Act is actually enforced by the Treasury Department. And what their job was to go find people who were doing bad things, right, and or with alcohol and take it. And so we don't know how much alcohol. I've tried to find this. I haven't found a good statistic, but billions, perhaps, of gallons, millions of gallons were poured into sewers, into the oceans, and you can see them trying to get rid of it all. Now, this story, though, is like everything. If you're rich, you could find alcohol. If you weren't, well, you were out of luck. So if you had money, this was easy to access. Now, it did help for a couple years. You can see 1921, they passed it in 1920. Look at this, 1921. But then it skyrockets again. And here's the thing. People find access to it. One of the worst thing that happens is we see the creation of something called bathtub gin, and people make their own alcohol in their bathtub. The problem is they don't know how to make it. So a lot of people poison themselves. One person I know of that blinded himself trying to make bathtub gin because they'd throw anything in there, alcohol that was for rubbing alcohol. And they would try to ferment all kinds of things to try to get it. One of the more important things that come out of this, of course, that was a backlash no one saw coming was the birth of organized crime. Of course, this is Al Capone here. And Al Capone will make his money off of bootlegging this alcohol. $60 million he made off of this. And so most people now look at this as sort of like, mistake whenever you try to ban something. This is one of the biggest debates about marijuana today, the significance, right? If you make marijuana illegal, it leads to organized crime, drug dealing. Well, what if we legalize it? What happens? So that was the response here. Of course, one of the words, and so this is the birthday. Whenever you use the word gang, most people think, oh, you're talking like, Bloods and Crips in LA or Harlem or something. Actually, no, what I'm talking about, first gangs were these bootleggers. And, one of the first massacres that happened on St. Valentine's Day in 1929 is these two rival gangs about bootleggers get into this nasty fight. And, I think a few people are killed here as the first gang war emerges in America. And all of a sudden, it is Capone who becomes the leader, the ruler of Chicago. Okay, last but not least, let's briefly talk about the president that changes everything. In 1901, President McKinley will be assassinating, leading the way for a new president, Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy is one of my favorite presidents. He's a lot of people's favorite president. He's just out there. He's energetic. He is a true progressive, and he gets involved in the American government, unlike the other presidents that came before him. Quick, just a little, this doesn't give you a lot of information, but a little detail about the kind of person he was. And then we'll talk about what kind of president he becomes.
I wonder how a man so thick-set, of rather abdominal contour, with eyes heavily spectacled, could have so much an air of magic and wild romance about him, could give one so stirring an impression of adventure and chivalry. The Metropolitan Magazine.
Fueled by cup after cup of coffee, served to him in a special mug his eldest son said was as big as a bathtub, Theodore Roosevelt raced through his day. Letters were answered upon receipt, a lifetime total of 150,000, dictated to shifts of weary stenographers.
Jefferson wrote 22,000 letters, and we regard him as one of the great correspondents in American history. Roosevelt wrote at least 150,000 letters. He's the writingest president in American history, by far, and a number of his books are American classics. So he's an intellectual. He read a book a day, sometimes 3 books in a day when he had some leisure. You think of Jefferson as America's Renaissance man, but it's really Roosevelt.
He would not stop talking. He was a one-man gas bag. But it was so interesting that most people didn't mind. One of my favorite stories is he heard that there was a famous big game hunter in Washington, and he said to some of the people on the staff, "Get that man over here. I'd really like to meet him." So this big, strapping English fellow was taken into the president's office, and the door was closed, and people outside the office heard this talking going on. Finally, the man emerged about an hour and a half later, looking just beat down as though he'd been through a storm. And one of the president's staff said, "What did you tell the president?" He said, "I told him my name."
We love him because of the energy. His laugh was infectious. His son Ted said, "My father had a dozen eggs for breakfast every morning." So he's a large man, and he's larger than life. Roosevelt once said, "There's nothing quite so exhilarating as being thrown over the shoulders of a 300-pound Japanese man." He played all these wild games in the White House. He wrestled with diplomats. He played a game called Single Stick with Leonard Wood, in which they would wrap themselves up in cushions and then beat the living daylights out of each other with sticks until Roosevelt had to stop.
He boxed with a young aide, too, until a blow caused him to lose vision in his left eye. Accordingly, I thought it better to acknowledge that I had become an elderly man and would have to stop boxing, he remembered. I then took up jiu-jitsu for a year or two. Photographers were forbidden to cover his daily tennis games because he thought voters considered tennis a rich man's pastime. But when a cameraman failed to capture his horse jumping over an obstacle, he was more than happy to make the jump again. Roosevelt bit me, the editor William Allen White said, and I went mad.
Okay, so what a guy, right? Who is he? Let's talk a little bit about him. I want to come back to him a little bit because he actually has kind of a different upbringing. So he comes from a very wealthy family. Roosevelt had a lot of money, but he was very sick. He was a sickly boy. He was acute asthmatic, and it was so bad that he couldn't really go outside. He laid in bed most days, and he struggled really for energy. He considered himself weak, and it really bothered him. And he eventually said, "I'm going to overcome this." And by exercise, he gave himself a very strict exercise regimen, and he was able to sort of come out of this. And it's so fascinating because you have somebody who's maybe one of the more sickly presidents born in childhood becomes one of the more energetic. Well, he goes to Harvard and he has all of this success there. He's a boxer and he gets married and is about to go into government, and something happens that changes his life. His mother and his wife die on the same day, and it completely devastates him. And he has one daughter at the time. He gives his daughter to his sister to take care of, and he packs his bag and he goes out west into the Dakotas, and he learns to cowboy. And this is why, though he wasn't from the West, Westerners loved Roosevelt, because he had that spirit of the West, that myth of the West we talked about. He brought it back to the East. When he came back, he got involved in politics. Most politicians were afraid of him. They thought he was too erratic, too capricious. They didn't know if you could trust him. But it didn't take him long to win, because he had this winning personality, to win the hearts of many Americans. He will be brought in as vice president, and then when the president gets shot, he becomes the president of the United States. One of the first things that Roosevelt introduces is something called the square deal, and he's all about Americans getting a fair deal. And he was a big progressive. He did not like what was happening in the Gilded Age. One of the first things he does is he goes to the miners at the anthracite mine in Pennsylvania, where there were all these strikes, and he says, we're gonna help you. And they weren't used to a president doing this. Most presidents before this, we talked about that, tended to be hands off. In all, it's estimated that Roosevelt took down 40 monopolies. And this is what we call him a trust buster. And trust is like a monopoly. It's like a monopoly buster. And, he even went after J.P. Morgan. And some of these big tycoons. And one of the things that really Roosevelt thought was that America should be competitive. There should be competition in all things. And if you get rid of competition and you make monopolies, then you've lost that American spirit of trying hard. So he wanted there to be multiple companies. So he helps sort of facilitate that. Another thing Teddy Roosevelt's a big fan of is conservation. He loves the outdoors. He loves the West. So he works for Pinochet, who becomes one of his advisors. He knows and is personal friends with John Muir, who's a big conservationist out west in California, Yosemite. And so Roosevelt spends a lot of his time establishing the U.S. Forest Service and trying to protect and preserve these areas. Of course, the West becomes the highlight. And during his president, while he didn't fulfill all these, he did get the ball rolling on the conservation of many of your national parks and forests today. Well, after his presidency, which was very successful, he had his understudy, a guy named William Howard Taft. And Taft was a really big man. He was a large man, 300 pounds. And he was supposed to keep going with this Roosevelt spirit, and he did, but Roosevelt was jealous. Roosevelt wanted to get back in the White House. And so Roosevelt decided to run again after 4 years of Taft. And what happened was it split the party. Roosevelt creates his own party called the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And he gets a lot of the Taft Republicans to vote for him. And that opens the door for Woodrow Wilson to come in and become a president. We haven't had a Democrat in the White House, a true Democrat, a true Southerner in the White House since Johnson in 65. So, now this is sort of an end to an era, but that's really the progressive era. So one last thing, and then we'll say goodbye. I know I'm kind of going on for a while here. It's been about an hour. Let me just end that maybe the most important things the progressives get done is in 1920, women get the right to vote. And this is going to be thankful to a person by the name of Alice Paul, who she leads the crusade. They march on DC's Capitol. They attend, and they're very ambitious. They're very, some would call them militant. One of the great stories of a suffragette, and this was somebody in England, but she actually, in order to get the attention of people, jumped out in front of a horse race and got trampled by horses. And she did this in front of all these politicians, all these government officials, just for the right for the women's suffrage movement. And it finally works. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. And it opens up a lot of freedom and autonomy for women, which we will talk about next time. Okay, that's it. That's where I'm going to end. Okay, so now it's up to you. What I would like you to do is, you've already had discussions on the West and on the Gilded Age. I would like you now to please make a couple comments about imperialism and the progressive era. What are some things that stood out to you? What are some things that I think make us think about how America is shaped by these things? Okay, hope you're doing okay. Please email me with any questions.